that Africa needs to re-engage among itself and decided on the best way we can save the people of our continent.
Namibia, Zambia, and Botswana have just done the unthinkable, tearing down colonial borders and forming a borderless Africa alliance where citizens can cross with nothing but a national ID. The West is in panic, US envoys rushing overnight to stop what they call a threat to stability. But why would three African nations risk shaking the world order? And why is Washington so desperate to keep them apart? Let's find that out. The announcement came quietly, yet its echoes thundered across the globe. In a joint declaration issued from Windhoek, Lusaka, and Gaborone, leaders of Namibia, Zambia, and Botswana confirmed what many had only whispered about: the creation of a borderless Africa alliance. It was not simply another trade agreement or diplomatic gesture. It was a political earthquake. For the first time in modern African history, three nations officially dismantled their colonial-era borders and allowed the free movement of people, goods, and ideas as if those borders never existed. Border posts that once stood as monuments of separation were suddenly reimagined. Families long accustomed to showing papers, waiting in queues, and paying bribes to cross a line on a map found themselves walking freely, carrying nothing but their national ID cards. Trucks hauling copper, diamonds, and cattle rolled across without the usual mountain of customs paperwork. The atmosphere at the crossing points was described by witnesses as both surreal and electric, as if history itself had shifted beneath their feet. Across African media, headlines screamed with excitement. "Colonial borders fall in southern Africa," declared one Namibian outlet. In Lusaka, talk radio programs buzzed with callers praising the move as the return of Africa to itself. In Botswana, students celebrated outside government buildings, waving flags and chanting slogans about unity. Social media exploded with videos of people walking across borders with tears in their eyes, ordinary men and women experiencing freedom of movement on their continent for the first time. Yet while Africans cheered, the Western world reacted with alarm. Within hours of the announcement, the US State Department released a statement dripping with diplomatic caution. It welcomed efforts toward regional cooperation, but warned of potential risks to stability and security. Behind the scenes, American envoys scrambled onto flights bound for Lusaka and Gaborone. Their mission was urgent: convince the governments that this alliance should proceed slowly, with consultation, with oversight, with conditions that would dilute its revolutionary power. But why such panic? Analysts in Washington admitted privately that the alliance threatened US influence at its core. Namibia holds some of the world's largest uranium reserves, vital for nuclear energy. Zambia's copper and cobalt are indispensable for electric vehicle batteries and global electronics. Botswana's diamonds dominate the global luxury trade. Together, under one borderless system, these nations could wield bargaining power that the West has long tried to prevent. The first ripples of this shift are already being felt. European corporations are nervously recalculating contracts. Mining companies accustomed to playing one African state against another are beginning to wonder what happens if three countries act as one. Even financial markets, often indifferent to African politics, reacted with caution as investors speculated on the alliance's impact on resource flows. In Africa itself, however, the response has been overwhelmingly hopeful. Activists, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens are describing the alliance as the boldest step toward Pan-Africanism since independence. Many are calling it a direct strike at the Berlin Conference of 1884-85, when Europeans divided Africa with rulers and maps, tearing communities apart. Now, at last, some of those colonial lines are being erased, not by foreign powers, but by Africans themselves. Still, with every celebration comes an unsettling question. If Africa is finally tearing down the walls of division, how long before outside powers move to build new ones? The US is already maneuvering, and Europe is watching closely. What they fear most is not just three countries uniting, but the possibility that others, Zimbabwe, Angola, and South Africa, may follow. Which brings us to the heart of the matter. How did Africa's borders come to hold so much power in the first place? And why have they remained so stubbornly intact for over a century, even as they strangled trade and divided families? If the news of a borderless alliance feels earth-shattering today, it is because those borders were never just lines. They were weapons. To understand why tearing them down matters, one must revisit the moment they were drawn. In 1884 to 85, European powers gathered in Berlin, far away from Africa, and without a single African voice in the room, carved up an entire continent like slices of a cake. This infamous Berlin Conference was not about governance, culture, or unity. It was about extraction and control. The rulers they used did not follow rivers, mountains, or trade routes. They cut straight through them. One line splits families into different colonies. Another line severed ancient trade corridors that had connected markets for centuries. Entire kingdoms were divided deliberately, their strength diluted so that they could never rise united against colonial rule. Borders were drawn to serve Europe's convenience, not Africa's reality, and the cruelty was precise. The Shona people were split between southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and Mozambique. The Ovambo were divided between Angola and Namibia. Trade routes that carried salt, gold, and cattle across southern Africa were suddenly blocked by checkpoints that demanded papers Africans did not even possess. A man could wake up one morning to find his village declared British territory, while his cousin's hut across the river was suddenly German territory. Overnight, neighbors became foreigners. This colonial engineering was not just physical, but psychological. Africans were taught to see each other through foreign categories. A farmer in Zambia was no longer part of a regional network of exchange. He was told he belonged to a nation-state whose borders were decided in Berlin. National identities were built around colonial fictions, while the larger African identity was suppressed. Africans were instructed to look outward, to London, Paris, Lisbon, rather than inward to their neighbors. Even after independence in the 20th century, those artificial borders remained intact. Why? Because the West insisted on it. Newly independent nations were warned that changing colonial borders would lead to instability. International law codified the principle of uti possidetis juris, which meant colonial borders had to remain frozen as they were at independence. It was a neat trick. Europe left, but its maps stayed, and those maps kept Africa divided. The consequences were devastating. Trade between African countries was suffocating. Moving goods from Zambia to Namibia required endless paperwork, bribes, and international clearance, as if crossing to one's neighbor was crossing into another world. Entire economies were designed to face outward. Zambia exported copper to Europe, Botswana sold diamonds to the West, and Namibia shipped uranium abroad. Intra-African trade, the lifeblood of self-reliance, was deliberately strangled. And so, colonial borders became more than lines, they became chains. Chains that ensured Africans depended on foreign markets. Chains that kept African unity a dream rather than a reality. Chains that made the idea of free African movement seem dangerous, even though Europeans themselves enjoyed open borders in the European Union. This is why the Borderless Africa Alliance is such a rupture. It is not just easing travel, it is undoing a weapon forged in Berlin. It is erasing the fiction that Africans must remain strangers to one another. By allowing movement with a national ID, Namibia, Zambia, and Botswana are saying something radical. We reject Berlin's map and reclaim our own. But if Berlin's borders were meant to divide, the next question becomes inevitable. Who benefits from keeping those borders in place today? Why would Western powers fight so hard to prevent Africa from tearing them down? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. The ink on the Borderless Africa Alliance Declaration was barely dry when Washington went into crisis mode. Behind the diplomatic smiles, U.S. officials understood immediately that something far bigger than 3 African nations opening borders had just happened. They saw a system, carefully built over decades to keep Africa divided, dependent, and exploitable, suddenly slipping out of their hands. American envoys were dispatched with urgency. Their brief was simple: slow this down, dress it in technical concerns, and wrap it in the language of partnership. Overnight meetings were convened in Lusaka, Gaborone, and Windhoek, where U.S. officials arrived armed with promises of aid and offers of security cooperation. These visits were presented as friendly gestures, but their timing betrayed their intent. Why the rush, if this alliance was truly harmless? Why scramble so frantically unless Washington feared its entire leverage in southern Africa collapsing before its eyes? The heart of Washington's panic lies in minerals. Zambia's copper and cobalt are the arteries of the digital economy. Without them, smartphones, laptops, and electric cars cannot function. Namibia's uranium is a silent cornerstone of global energy. Botswana's diamonds, beyond their luxury image, sustain billions in global markets. Each resource alone is significant. Together, they form a strategic arsenal. And for decades, the West has relied on keeping these countries isolated, each negotiating separately, each vulnerable to pressure. The Borderless Africa Alliance shatters that design. 3 states acting as one bloc can no longer be picked off individually. They can pool bargaining power, demand fair prices, and choose trading partners outside the Western sphere. Suddenly, deals with China or Russia are not outliers, they are alternatives. The monopoly of Western corporations begins to crumble. That is why American rhetoric has shifted to stability concerns. The phrase sounds benign, but in diplomatic language, it is code. Stability means stability of Western access. Risk means risk of losing control. By branding African unity as destabilizing, Washington tries to frame its fear as a global problem. It is a strategy straight from the Cold War playbook, where African independence was often painted as dangerous unless guided or restrained by Western oversight. But minerals are not the only reason for panic. Military strategy is at stake too. Through AFRICOM and a network of bases, the U.S. has built influence by presenting itself as Africa's security guarantor. This logic works only when Africa remains fragmented, each nation too small to secure itself. A borderless bloc in southern Africa, managing its own security and trade routes, undermines that entire narrative. Why would Africans accept U.S. troops on their soil if they can protect themselves by standing together? The sabotage is subtle but relentless. Aid packages are dangled with fine print that locks governments into dependency. Security cooperation comes with conditions, equipment that requires U.S. maintenance, and training that builds loyalty to foreign doctrine. Loans are offered for infrastructure that ends up tying economies to repayment cycles stretching decades. Washington dresses these as gifts, but African leaders increasingly see them for what they are: shackles forged in policy rather than steel. And yet, for all the maneuvering, the alliance has exposed a weakness in Western strategy. Africans are not rushing into the streets to demand American aid. They are celebrating newfound unity. The contrast could not be sharper. African joy at tearing down colonial barriers, Western panic at losing colonial leverage. The question now grows sharper. If Washington fears the economic and political consequences of this alliance, what does Africa itself stand to gain? Beyond symbolism, how might this borderless pact transform trade, culture, and everyday life in southern Africa? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. To grasp the magnitude of the Borderless Africa Alliance, one must look beyond geopolitics and into the daily lives of Africans. What Washington sees as a threat, Africans experience as liberation. And this liberation is unfolding on 2 fronts: the economy and culture. Economically, the alliance is already dismantling some of the most suffocating barriers to intra-African trade. Consider a copper truck leaving Zambia for Namibia's Walvis Bay port. Under the old system, the driver faced multiple stops, mountains of customs paperwork, and hours, sometimes days, of delays. Each checkpoint was an opportunity for bribes, each forming another hurdle designed to slow the flow of goods. Now, with the alliance in place, the same truck moves almost seamlessly. Time is saved, costs are cut, and trade efficiency surges. This isn't just a matter of convenience, it changes the mathematics of trade. Lower costs mean African producers can compete more effectively in regional markets. Goods once priced out of reach for neighboring consumers can now be sold affordably. A farmer in Botswana, for example, can sell beef directly into Zambian markets without watching profits swallowed by border bureaucracy. A small manufacturer in Namibia can access Zambian copper or Botswanan diamonds more easily, fueling the local industry. In short, the alliance converts borders from barriers into bridges. The ripple effects extend further. Infrastructure investment suddenly becomes more attractive. A railway line connecting Zambia's copper belt to Walvis Bay is not just a national project, it becomes a regional artery, moving goods for three economies at once. Energy grids and water systems, long fragmented, can be integrated to serve a broader market. The alliance is therefore not only tearing down barriers, but creating the logic for new roads, new railways, and new industries. But perhaps the most profound impact is cultural. Colonial maps did not merely divide economies, they divided identities. Generations of Africans were taught to see their neighbors as foreigners, even when they shared language, culture, and bloodlines. Border guards reinforced this message, demanding papers from cousins visiting each other, teaching entire populations that their unity was illegal. The alliance has flipped this script overnight. Families are reuniting without the humiliation of paperwork. Traders are crossing with dignity. Students are attending universities across borders with a simple ID card. These shifts, though seemingly ordinary, carry enormous symbolic weight. They whisper to a new generation of Africans, "You are not strangers in your land," and it goes further still. Artists, musicians, and cultural workers are seizing the new mobility to reconnect traditions cut off for over a century. A festival in Windhoek may now easily feature performers from Lusaka and Gaborone, blending sounds and stories that colonial borders once silenced. Academic exchanges, sporting tournaments, and business expos are flourishing with a vibrancy that bureaucratic restrictions once strangled. What is unfolding, then, is not merely trade liberalization, it is a cultural renaissance. The alliance is reawakening the sense that Africa is one body, wounded by colonial surgery, but capable of healing itself. Economic integration provides the skeleton. Cultural unity provides the soul. And this renaissance points to something larger than economics or culture alone. If three nations can trigger such a transformation, what happens if others, Zimbabwe, Angola, South Africa, join? What if, instead of isolated experiments, Africa begins to weave a continental fabric of unity? That is the question looming now, not in Washington's corridors of fear, but in Africa's streets of hope. For this alliance may be more than an agreement among three countries. It may be the spark of a Pan-African dream that the world's empires have long tried to extinguish. When Namibia, Zambia, and Botswana announced their alliance, skeptics dismissed it as symbolic. But symbolism has a way of becoming reality, and in Africa, reality spreads quickly. Already, leaders in Zimbabwe, Angola, and even South Africa are watching closely. If three nations can dismantle colonial borders, why not 5, 10, or 50? The real fear in Western capitals is not the success of these three. It is the domino effect. A borderless bloc in southern Africa is not just a convenience for trade. It is a blueprint for a continent that no longer waits for instructions. The African Union has long spoken of integration, but bureaucratic inertia often dulled its impact. What Namibia, Zambia, and Botswana have done is prove that boldness, not bureaucracy, can change the map. And this raises an uncomfortable reality for the West. What happens to global power structures when Africa stops playing by their rules? For decades, Western powers designed trade systems that kept Africa exporting raw materials while importing finished goods. They engineered debt cycles through institutions like the IMF and World Bank, ensuring dependency disguised as development. They installed military bases under the pretense of security, but in truth to guard resource flows. But a continent that erases borders reclaims leverage. Imagine African states negotiating as one entity for cobalt, uranium, or oil, setting prices, not accepting them. Imagine a unified visa system allowing the continent's 1.4 billion people to move, work, and trade freely, creating the world's largest single market. Imagine African universities, research centers, and industries collaborating without colonial red tape. This is not fantasy. It is the logical extension of the Borderless Africa Alliance. The West knows this, which is why it is scrambling. In Washington, analysts whisper that the alliance could tilt Africa decisively toward alternative partners like China, Russia, or even South-South collaborations with Latin America. In Paris and London, policymakers worry that neo-colonial influence, the quiet extraction of wealth, will collapse. A borderless Africa is not just independent, it is untouchable. And yet, beyond the fear lies a deeper truth. Africa is no longer asking permission. The generation leading this movement is unafraid of Western disapproval. They grew up in the shadow of broken promises, IMF loans that strangled economies, and aid packages that arrived with political strings. They know that every warning about instability is code for Western discomfort. And so, their resolve hardens. What this means for Africans is profound. It means a future where passports are no longer shackles, where mineral wealth circulates within Africa before it feeds foreign markets, where youth can seek education and work across the continent without being treated as strangers. It means a new African identity, rooted not in colonial borders, but in continental unity. This future terrifies the West because it signals the end of an era, the end of Africa as a warehouse of raw materials, the end of Africa as a testing ground for foreign troops, the end of Africa as a bargaining chip in global rivalries. Instead, it signals the rise of Africa as a power in its own right, writing its destiny. And yet, perhaps the most powerful aspect of the Borderless Africa Alliance is not what it changes today, but what it makes possible tomorrow. By tearing down borders, Namibia, Zambia, and Botswana have issued a challenge to the rest of the continent. Are you willing to stay trapped in Berlin's map, or are you ready to redraw Africa for Africans? The answer to that question will decide not just Africa's future, but the balance of the world itself. Do you believe Africa is finally breaking free from the chains of colonial borders? Should more African nations join the Borderless Africa Alliance immediately? Let us know in the comments section. If the West tries to stop it, should Africa even care what they think? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.